Here we are in Chapter 3 where we are going to take a look at the ethics in behavioral research. It's a very important chapter. A lot of people try to gloss over the ethics of doing research, but it's actually a very important aspect in research methodology. We must be careful to protect the rights and privacy of the people or animals that we are working with. Even when we're using data that doesn't appear to be important in terms of keeping things ethically sound. For example, like looking through newspaper articles from 200 years ago, we still need to be careful that we are appreciating the fact that these are real people who existed and who have family members now. So it is important that we are being careful with our research, even with cases that you might think that wouldn't have any ethics applied to them. So let's jump into the objectives of what we're talking about in Chapter 3. And in Chapter 3, we're going to talk about Milgram's obedience experiment, both from the practical standpoint of what we learned from it, but also from the ethical standpoint and why there are some issues with it. We're going to talk about the principles outlined in the Belmont Report, which are beneficence, autonomy, and justice. Those are the three big topics that come up in research all the time. And whenever you're doing research, you have to justify the beneficence, autonomy, and justice of the study. We're going to talk about deception and some ethical issues that surround its use in research. We're going to look at how to create and obtain informed consent. We are going to discuss potential problems in obtaining informed consent because it's not just a matter of asking somebody for their permission. We're going to talk about debriefing and the function of the Institutional Review Board. Moving on, we're going to look at categories of risk in doing ethics because sometimes there are certain levels of risks that require certain amounts of oversight in a project. We'll be talking about the APA Ethics Code. We'll be talking about the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. We'll be talking about risks and benefits in research, and then we will talk about misrepresentation of research findings, including plagiarism and how to avoid it. So there's a lot that goes into this chapter, and I trust that you've done your reading because you are all good students, and hopefully that this will be a good way for you to solidify some of the information. So let's jump right into the Milgram experiment. And before we talk about this, I want you to take a look at that link. It's also in Blackboard, so you don't have to copy and paste it by typing it. So look in Blackboard under Chapter 3 and you'll find that link there. So go ahead and take a look at that, and then we'll talk just a little bit about what happened in that study and why there are some issues with the ethics. So now that you have had a chance to look at that, we're going to talk about what happened in that study. So in the Milgram experiment, this was something that Stanley Milgram designed as a way to look at how people were tricked. I don't know if that's maybe the right word, but maybe they were convinced that doing these atrocious things to the Jews who were interned was reasonable. And you might think to yourself, well, I wouldn't do that. Well, you'd be surprised at what you would do. And this experiment by Stanley Milgram was one of the ways that we were able to determine what the threshold was for people and what they would do. So you have the teacher and the student in the study, and then you have the doctor, who's somebody in a white coat. And the person in the white coat is the person who is an authority figure. And we've already learned that just because somebody's in an authority position doesn't mean that what they say is necessarily truth. So you have the student who is in on it altogether. So this person knows from the start that this is just an experiment and there is some deception that's taking place. That person is going to be acting as if they are actually getting shocked. Then you have the teacher, who is the participant in the study. And the teacher is going to be thinking that they are administering an electric shock. And you saw in the video how the teacher kind of said, I'm not going to do this to this guy. This guy's screaming in pain. But he kept going anyways. And he was prepared to give a lethal shock to the person. And he thought that maybe he had done something really bad. And what that suggests is that just because he was told to go on and that he wasn't responsible for it, he went ahead and did it. He was obedient to that study. So we learned about how people can be obedient despite the fact that they have objections. the ethical issues come into play when you consider the well-being of the individual who is the teacher. The individual who was the teacher learned something about himself that day. He learned that he was prepared to kill somebody, that he administered a shock that he thought that may have killed somebody. He can't unlearn that. That's not something that you can just think, oh, it was just an experiment and nobody was really hurt. That is true. Nobody was really hurt, but he cannot unlearn that he was ready to kill somebody just because somebody asked him to. Now, he might be able to think to himself, well, I wasn't really responsible, and even had I done something bad, it wouldn't have been my responsibility. But even so, that just doesn't make it okay for him in his conscience. The other aspect that happened was that the debriefing was not valuable to that thought process. So even though there was some debriefing, it wasn't valuable to the thought process that the individual could have harmed somebody. So there are lots of ways that there were unethical practices in this study beyond what we had just mentioned, but it's a good way to kind of start thinking about how we need to be careful about how we conduct experiments, how we ask people to participate, and the value of the deception compared to the debriefing in terms of how it actually lets the individual off the hook who was in the study. Now, there are three main ethical standards that we're going to take a look at in this chapter. One of them is the Nuremberg Code, one's the Declaration of Helsinki, and the other is the Belmont Report. We're going to be focusing on the Belmont Report because it tends to be the going standard of how we do research now. So I want to take a look first at the Nuremberg Code. I'm going to drag my window over here from Chrome and just take a look at a couple of the things. Oh, I hate it when it does that. It tries to think for me. And this is the National Institute for Health. All right, one more time. Stop snapping. Okay. The National Institutes of Health. And the Nuremberg Code is a historical document that was based on the idea that what happened during the Nazi internment was bad. Obviously, it wasn't good what the Nazis did to the interned Jews. So the Nuremberg Code says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to set up a standard that protects the rights of the participants in studies. Well, it was okay. It was the first step in the right direction, but I want to point out something that is that's particularly interesting. And what it does is it relies on the subjectivity of the individual who is doing the study. So when you think about who is participating in the study, you look at number 6 and you think the degree of risk should be taken. The degree of risk to be taken should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian of the importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment. Okay, so that means somebody has to make a judgment. Somebody has to say, well, it's worth it to do this because it is going to be some kind of humanitarian endeavor. It's going to be important and we're going to solve some issues because of it. Okay, that's not bad, but it leaves it up to the subjectivity of the person conducting the study, which in some cases can be bad because not everybody has good judgment. There are also some other aspects of the Nuremberg Code that kind of lead to the idea that there is some subjectivity and some interesting aspects that you still wouldn't want to participate in. So, for example, number 5, no experiment should be conducted where there is an a priori reason, an a priori meaning a before the experiment reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur. That sounds good. Oh, except perhaps in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as the subjects. So if somebody is willing to engage in the study, then that gives them the right to make somebody else or to ask somebody else to be in that study. That's not necessarily good either because we do know that there are people out there that have different thresholds to suffering. And what that means is that if my threshold to suffering is higher than yours and I do this experiment, that means that I can ask you to do it too. I encourage you to take a look at the Nuremberg Code in more detail as you would like to. There's a link to that in the chapter as well, on Blackboard for chapter 3. So take a look at that and you can see how the history of the Nuremberg Code tends to set the stage even though it's not completely adequate. Next is the Declaration of Helsinki. The Declaration of Helsinki is an improvement on the Nuremberg Code. What the Declaration of Helsinki says is that we're going to take the same policies that were in place, but we're going to make these more principled. We're going to make it more from a medical setting, where it's important for us to understand that there is a progression toward the health and overall well-being of the participants, and not just basically rationalizing it based on our subjectivity as experimenters, but saying that we're going to approach it from a medical perspective that has a couple of very important aspects, which is basically we're going to put the health of our participants first above anything else, and that we will do no harm. So you kind of incorporate the Hippocratic Oath into an understanding of how we are going to provide some kind of guidance on how to protect our participants. There was also some information in the Declaration of Helsinki about how we are going to include journalistic accountability for publishing, meaning that we're going to publish things as they are, not doctoring them, not tailoring them, but we're going to publish our results accurately, and we are going to try to publish them even if the results didn't appear to be what we wanted them to be. So it's an important step in the right direction for accountability. Last is the Belmont Report. We are going to talk about, in the Belmont Report, how we use beneficence, justice, and respect for person. Yes, I want to open that. Thank you. In order to protect the rights of the individuals in a study. So in the Belmont Report, it covers several main aspects. First, well, in front of all that is who we have to credit all this wonderful work to. But the table of contents outlines that we're going to talk about boundaries between practice and research. So making sure that we are not doing research with the people that we are working with in a practice setting. For example, I would not include somebody who was one of my patients in psychotherapy in my research. Okay, that's not an okay thing to do. The basic ethical principles, which we've kind of outlined already, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, is another aspect of the Belmont Report. And then last is the application of it, so the informed consent, the risk assessment, and selection of subjects. We're going to focus for the next few moments on respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. But this is an important document for you to be familiar with in order to understand how we do ethics in research. So I'm going to scroll down to section B, where we talk about respect for persons. And this is essentially outlining how we protect individuals and their autonomy. We want to make sure that they are able to make decisions for themselves. We want to make sure that they have the right to stop doing something when they want to, and that we aren't asking them to do something in a way that makes them feel coerced into engaging in a study. Essentially, we give them the right to participate in the study as they wish to and to stop whenever they wish to. Beneficence is to do good. So this is one of the things that the Declaration of Helsinki really did a good job of saying, well, we're going to dedicate ourselves to the well-being of our subjects, our participants, and also doing no harm to them, which is sections 1 and 2, and it also alludes to the Hippocratic Oath, the Hippocratic maxim of do no harm. We want to make sure that people are treated well, and that the object of doing our study is to do no harm. Last is justice, which is about fairness. So let's say that we are doing a study on or we're doing some research on how to study better for an exam. Well, what that means is that we're probably going to have one group that gets this wonderful study routine that says, okay, we're going to teach you how to study for an exam to do well on it. And another group is not going to be given that information. Unfortunately, that is not justice. In order for us to fairly distribute the benefits of the study, we have to apply the benefits of the study to each person in the study. So after the study has been conducted and we've found what we're going to find, then we also need to have the group that was not in the treatment group, who did not get the special instructions on how to study for an exam, we have to give them those instructions and teach them in the exact same way that the other group was. We wouldn't want them to feel like they were not justified in their research, and we want them to feel like that they get something out of it. This can also be in terms of a drug trial. Let's say that we're doing a drug trial and we have a medication for depression that appears to work really well in one group, and then the absence of that medication does not improve the depression of another group. Well, after the study, the group that did not benefit from the treatment will also need to receive the treatment. There are 5 basic aspects of justice, and you can just kind of read through those, that everybody gets an equal share so that there's fairness there. Each person according to individual needs, so that doesn't mean that everybody gets the same thing. For example, if we wanted to see if some kind of physical task had an effect on cognitive processing, we could have somebody who engaged in a mile run and then did a multiplication times table. And we could see if there was a difference, and they might need to recover by drinking some water or maybe having a snack or something. But somebody may not, because they're already in good physical shape, so the individual need may be different for each person. Individual effort to each person according to societal contribution, and to each person according to merit. So basically, we want to make sure that people are treated as they deserve to be treated. That's the underlying essence of justice, and that includes fairness, etc. So those are the 3 major aspects of the Belmont Report that I wanted to just touch on, so that you understand that it's important to look at that. I encourage you to read through this more carefully than what we're going over in this lecture. Please don't confuse this lecture for all that I need you to know about this stuff. You still need to be familiar with the other texts that we're not touching on here. Okay. So that is the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report is a document that all researchers need to be familiar with. Again, I mentioned that earlier. And also, you will probably end up using this if you do any kind of research in the master's or doctoral level. And what that means is that you will have to refer to the Belmont Report and say how you are addressing that when you apply to have your study done. We'll talk about the IRB and what that means a little bit later. So the APA, with the American Psychological Association, has a code of ethics, and the code of ethics covers 5 general principles, and it covers beneficence, fidelity and responsibility, integrity, justice, respect for persons. Look at this: beneficence, justice, respect for persons. Those 3 are included in how we treat other people according to the Belmont Report. Fidelity and responsibility has to do with faithfulness and responsibility to psychology, to being responsible for how the research is conducted and the faithfulness of the research that you're doing. So it has to do with being accountable. Then integrity has to do with kind of the individual characteristics of the psychologist who is producing the research. They need to make sure that they are acting integrous or doing what they say that they're going to do. Again, the fidelity and responsibility and the integrity aspects have to do with the characteristics and the qualities of the researcher and doing what they're saying they're going to do with accountability. You can look at the APA Code of Ethics to get a better understanding of those 5. I encourage you to look over that as well. The 10 sections of the APA Code of Ethics, I do want to take a look at that, so let me just bring that up real quick. That's exciting. Oh, because you're trying to download it. That's okay. We don't need to download it. But the APA Code of Ethics covers 10 sections, and some of it has to do with the actual practice of it. Some of it has to do with research. Some of it has to do with a personal set of ethics. But here's the, I'll stop that. Here's a general ethics code. As you can see the preamble has some interesting information in it. But the general principles, those are those 5: beneficence, non-malfeasance, fidelity, responsibility, integrity, justice, and respect for persons, rights, and dignity. But they have sections 1 through 10 that talk about the different aspects of how you are going to do psychology. And some of it has to do with research and publication. Look at that. It has to do with an institutional approval using an IRB, informed consent, recording. We have subordinate research programs, meaning there is information on how to conduct research with subordinates, so client patients, students, and subordinates. I don't know that I would like to do any research with a client or patient, but the APA does allow you to do that in some cases. You have to be very careful about it. Dispensing with informed consent. So there's even a clause in here that talks about when you don't need informed consent. Well, there's also how you talk about inducements for research. So how do you ask people to do research and sometimes pay them to do it? Deception in research, debriefing, human care and use of animals in research, reporting research results, plagiarism, publication credit, duplicate publication of data, sharing research for verification and reviewers. Those are all having to do with the kind of research that you are going to be doing in this class. So I encourage you to read through this and be especially careful with the aspects that have to do with informed consent, debriefing in particular, because we'll do some debriefing, and also with how to publish to avoid plagiarism and giving credit, which is through in-text citation and authorship credits. This is not above your understanding to read through, so be particularly diligent about reading through this so that you can have an understanding of how we use the APA Ethics Code. And keep in mind, that's just Section 8 of 10. There are other sections that you could be interested in looking at, but it really has to do with research and publication for this class. If you are going into the psychology field, or even if you're not, these are some really good principles to abide by. Even if you're going into social work or counseling or whatever it is, these 10 principles work very well in that. You will have your own ethics code if you're going into social work or if you're going into counseling, but even so, these work really well for all kinds. So that's the APA Ethics Code. And let's take a look at risk and benefit assessment. So the idea of risk and benefit assessment is, are we going to get out of the research something that will benefit society without increasing risk to the participants or the subjects? That's the important benefit risk assessment that you have to think about. So when you think about the potential risks and benefits, think of things like as risk: physical harm, psychological stress and distress, loss of privacy or confidentiality. One of the most interesting aspects of privacy and confidentiality that has to do with recruiting participants for a study is how we actually make first contact with our subject or participants. Let's say that we want to set up a study at little old Olivet College, and we want to know how people feel about a certain topic. And maybe we could use a hot button topic right now, racism, and we could get people to come in for a focus group, and that says something like, there's one of those things that's posted in the stairwells that said, be a part of our focus group. We want to know how you feel about racism. And, you've seen those things where they have the pieces of paper that you can tear off of the ad so that you can have the phone number or whatever. If you are walking up and down the stairs and you see this study and you think to yourself, well, that's interesting, and you go to rip off a tag and you want to be a participant, unknowingly, you have given up your privacy because somebody could see you taking that tag and understanding that you're interested in a study. The researcher would also be responsible for you ethically because they have subjected you to a violation of your privacy. When you are advertising for a study, you have to be careful that the people who are interested in the study aren't going to be seen giving a lot of thought into their participation. It sounds silly, but it's true. We have to be careful and protect the privacy of the individuals, and that means even from the time that we recruit them, their privacy needs to remain intact. Now, some benefits include new skills or education, material benefits, or personal satisfaction. Some people feel good about participating because they feel like they're being helpful. There's also some material benefits. Maybe somebody is getting paid for being in there. Maybe at the end of at the end of the study, they're given a swag bag, the stuff we all get. So they're given a T-shirt or something. That can happen from being in a focus group usually. Or it could be new skills or education. You could learn something new. In the example I gave earlier about studying for an exam, you could get new skills or education about how to take an exam. All pretty cool stuff. So you have some benefits and you have some risks. I'm going to refer to Capella University's assessing risk in research form that I actually used when I was doing my research, because you must do a risk assessment to convince the IRB that your research is worth doing. So let's take a look at that. Again, all these things that I'm linking to are in your resources. in the chapter on Blackboard. So this is the Capella University Assessing Risk in Research, and it covers several things. It talks about minimal and greater than minimal risk designations, which are what we'll be talking about, a pretty standard thing in psychological research, potential risks, and then determine the risk level. And some interesting information about magnitude and probability. Again, this is for doctoral research, so you have to do a little bit more thinking about it. I just want to show you some of the categories of risk and how we can minimize them. So we have several categories of risk: inconvenience, physical harm, economic, financial hardship, psychological harm, legal harm, social harm, loss of privacy and confidentiality, and group harms. So when you look through these, you can see that there are some ideas that have to go into inconvenience. So when you think of inconvenience, are people going to be giving up a disproportionate amount of their time? Is it worth it? Might it be inconvenient for them to drive somewhere to a study? So there is an inherent risk there that something is inconvenient. Physical harm includes discomfort, pain, injury, illness, disease, or life-threatening injury or illness. Ideally, that's not going to happen in a lot of psychological research, but it could. It certainly could that somebody engages maybe in a stress test to where we try to stress them to the point that they're kind of at their maximum heart rate, respiration is high. Then we might ask them to do a cognitive test and see what the intersection is between physical exertion and cognition. That could include some physical harm that we'd have to be able to justify. Economic or financial harm. Are people going to miss work to come to this study? Might there be a loss of an opportunity? Hopefully not, but that could happen where some people might be engaged in research that could take them away from work. Maybe they lose a job because they didn't show up. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's not my fault, but you did present an opportunity for them to make that decision. Now, you could probably justify and say that it's an adult person who needs to be more careful about the risk and reward of being in the study. But again, you provided the opportunity and you have to take some responsibility for that. Psychological harm, which could happen, things like worry, anxiety, and stress, discomfort, confusion, distress or fear, depression, embarrassment, shame, guilt. Think of the Milgram experiment. The teacher probably experienced some guilt, maybe some embarrassment for being fooled, maybe some worry, anxiety, and stress. Just because something was debriefed and everything was okay doesn't mean that somebody isn't going to continue feeling those ways. Legal harm could happen. It's not very likely, but it's possible that somebody engages in some kind of legal harm as a result of the study. I would hope not, but it is possible. Social harm, maybe social embarrassment, loss of respect or reputation, loss of social standing or status, and stigma. Maybe that thing that somebody is looking at that you've advertised in the stairwell at Olivet College says something like, are you having a hard time managing your attention deficit disorder? Come to this focus group to learn ways to be able to focus better and study better. Okay, somebody sees another individual looking at that, and the individual who is looking at the advertisement turns around and sees 3 or 4 people staring at them. They might feel embarrassed. They might feel the stigma. So we have to be careful about how we advertise and how we present our research to people who are going to be in the study. Loss of confidentiality and privacy, I already talked about that. And group harms. Are there possible ways that our study could impair a particular group of individuals? That could be done through stigma. It could be done in many different ways. So they give an example of a study of alcoholism within a tribal community. There are studies that report that there are higher incidents of alcohol use among people who are in tribal communities. Sometimes we call them Native American communities. The reality there is that if you had a study and people knew about it, then what it could do is it could say to the average person, oh, they're doing a study on alcoholism. That means that there is an alcoholism issue in this community. Well, maybe there is an alcoholism in a particular community, but people will take that information and broaden it out and say, oh, there is a alcoholism in all Native communities. So we could do harm by advertising research in a particular way or making it known. So we have to be careful how we present our research, and we have to assess the risks by looking at these risk categories and determining if we have a magnitude of risk that is particularly high. So that is the risk and benefit assessment. Let's take a look at informed consent. Informed consent is a way to get permission when we want people to participate in our study. When we ask people to be in our study, they are considered to be prospective participants. After we obtain informed consent, they become participants. The difference is that once somebody engages in informed consent and agrees to informed consent, they are now a participant in our study, and we are in agreement to what they are going to do. So the informed consent outlines many things, including what the role of the participant is in the study. So APA Section 8 has the basic requirements for this, and generally the following aspects are included. The purpose of the research, the procedures that will be used, the risk, benefits, and compensation, confidentiality, assurance of voluntary participation and permission to withdraw, and contact information for questions. And there is some overlap in the APA code and the Belmont report in the categories that are interesting to those two documents and the informed consent. So the purpose of the research is why somebody is, the purpose of the research is why we are conducting our research. Sometimes the purpose of the research is for a community gain. Sometimes it is for a research purpose that's going to guide other information, like it could be for policy development. It could be an experimental design where we are trying to test the differences between two particular treatments or a treatment in a control group. Whatever it is, we have to tell people why we're doing our research. We need to tell people why we are, what procedures we're using. So how are we going to use the participants, and what are the procedures that we are going to engage with? We also want to let them know that there are some risks, some benefits, and if there is any compensation. We want to tell them how their confidentiality is going to be protected. Maybe we tell them that all their information will be de-identified, meaning that we won't have any information that links them to an individual respondent, maybe aside from a number, but that's not something that we would be able to link them to. You would probably tell them that there won't be any identifying information in terms of location, name, anything like that, but maybe that we are interested in something like their race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, whatever it is. We might want to know that because it's important for our research. We assure them that they are going to volunteer and that they have permission to withdraw at any time, meaning that whenever they want to be out of the study, they are out of the study with no questions asked. And the last is that there is some contact information for questions. We want to make sure that we allow the individual in the study to be able to contact the researchers in order to ask questions or to follow up if they have any problems or things that they need to follow up with. Now, an important aspect of informed consent is autonomy. And the problem with autonomy is that not everybody who we want to be in a research has the ability to give assent or consent for research. And we call them vulnerable populations. So consent versus assent. Consent is when we have somebody who is able to give their own agreement to be in the study and there are no limitations to their ability to do so. But in order to get people to participate in a study who don't have the ability to give consent, that is, people who are not legally independent, who might have mental disabilities or cognitive disabilities, people who are being coerced into a study. For example, if somebody feels as if they must be in a study for a particular reason, then they are not autonomous. Somebody who has to have a guardian, so somebody who is under the age of 18, or somebody who has a legal guardian for various reasons. And also depending on level of understanding. There are some adults that can't understand instructions well enough to give consent, so then they must have somebody else assist them with consent. In those cases where people don't have legal independence, who don't have mentally capable states of mind, who are not experiencing something without coercion, who don't have to have guardians, or people who have a good level of understanding, those people can give consent. Anybody else gives assent, which means that there is a different level to it. So when we get assent from somebody, what it means is that they cannot give consent for some reason. So we are using a substitute called assent, and generally that works for most research. So when you think about informed consent, think about whether or not people can by themselves autonomously give consent, or if they have to have assent. I recommend using studies where everybody can give their own consent, but I recognize also that there is an interest sometimes to work with vulnerable populations who give assent. When we do our research for research methods, when we're doing our surveys, we are going to use assent, and not because we're working with vulnerable populations, but because we actually can't get consent from somebody electronically. We need to have an ink signature in order to get consent, or a digital signature in some cases. We're moving toward that, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to have people agree to the terms of our study because it's a survey, and it's low risk, and it's not likely to have any kind of high magnitude if something were leaked as a result of it, because they will be completely anonymous surveys because we're not getting any identifying information within reason. So in those cases, they will give assent by checking a box that says something like, we agree to participate in this study. So we will be using assent. But generally, we want to avoid that because it's a little bit trickier. But again, I also appreciate that if you want to work with the vulnerable population, you can work with assent, and usually you're going to be working with another individual besides the participant in order to get that. Another important aspect of informed consent is deception and withholding information. Sometimes we must withhold information at the outset of a study in order to get the results that we'd like to have. A really good example of this actually comes from our research methods class from probably 2 or 3 years ago. We had a group that was interested in the biases that people had based on skin color, but not necessarily those people who were African American. They were studying people who had skin tones similar to those who were traditionally classified as African American, and they wanted to know if those people were likely to be subjected to the same kind of biases as those who were not African American but resembled African American descent individuals. So what they did was they had a collection of people, and they took these images free from Google, and they classified them as either somebody who appeared to be African American, people who were actually African American, and those who did not appear to be African American, who were not African American, but still had darker skin tones. So maybe somebody from the Middle East. So maybe somebody from the region of Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan. They also had people from Egyptian descent, which has a characteristically different skin tone than some others. So it's very interesting. They had a whole different line of skin tones. And what they did was they asked the individuals to rate these faces based on whether or not they would be selected for additional screening at TSA. Meaning, would the individuals be likely to be profiled because of their skin tone, not because of their nationalities? And this was also tied into a hypothesis that people from the Middle East would actually have more bias than those who didn't. But we were looking at skin tone and trying to see if we could separate the idea of skin tone and nationality and how people were biased against people with different skin tones. So we can't obviously tell the individuals in the study that we are going to determine if you have a bias against people with particular skin tones. That's not really a good way to do a study, because obviously people are not going to want to do that, and they are going to perform differently because they don't want to be seen as somebody with a bias. So what we did instead was we asked the individuals to determine if the people in the pictures would be likely to be screened because of the way that they looked. And what that does is it takes the people out of the first person, and they say, would somebody else profile them, which is really just a projection. So we did the study, and it worked really well. And the feedback we got from the individuals was that they didn't feel duped. They didn't feel like it was a bad way of deception. And the debriefing let them off the hook. We explained to them. Now, the deception was necessary because we couldn't have gotten the results that we did if people knew what was happening. They would have performed differently. And the way that we got the information was pretty harmless, and people, based on their own self-report, did not feel bad about the way that their participation in the study went. The Milgram experiment obviously used deception as well. I encourage you to review that, and you can look at some of the ways that there is deception. It's pretty obvious, which is why we use the Milgram case in research methods. Now, in order to satisfy the idea of deception, we must also engage in debriefing. So debriefing occurs after the completion of the study, after the information that you tell the individuals would not matter anymore in terms of how the research data was collected. We want to give the individuals the opportunity to reflect and to tell them that we withheld information, explain why the deception was necessary, and provide additional resources if necessary. In some cases, if you withhold information and people feel a certain way about it, it's your responsibility as a researcher to let them know that there are resources that they can use if they're feeling a particular way about it. Maybe it's contacting the researcher for additional information. Hopefully it wouldn't need any kind of mental health therapy as a result of it, but there are cases where that could be true. The debriefing is meant to ensure the participants leave the experiment without any ill feelings toward the field of psychology. We want them to feel good about the fact that their participation was genuinely helpful, even if they felt deceived. We want to remind them of the positive aspects, and that if they have any questions about the negative feelings that they're having, that they can continue to reach out if they need to. Now, we've talked about some aspects that start to build a case for doing research and some of the considerations. We're going to focus the rest of the time on IRBs and the idea of maintaining ethical representation of ideas. Now, an IRB is called an Institutional Review Board. We need an IRB to make sure that the research that is going on is done in an accountable way. The IRB is an accountability board that looks at many different aspects of research to determine if the risk is worth doing the research, and making sure that the researchers are doing their research in alignment with the principles of the APA and the Belmont Report specifically. There are lots of aspects that go into an IRB. And when you're thinking about doing research, think about the ways that we use the IRB. There are some cases where you don't need to have an IRB review your research, and there are some cases where there is minimal review, and sometimes there are full reviews, and we're going to talk about the difference between those just briefly. The research that we're going to do in this class is exempt research because it's done for educational purposes. It's completely anonymous, and it's done without any publication intentionality. We have two basic levels of IRB review. There's minimal risk and greater than minimal risk. Minimal risk includes those things that are completely anonymous, and that research that's done using archives and other methods of gathering data that is not based on collecting new data. So sometimes they're called retrospective, where you're looking backward. Greater than minimal risk, usually anytime you use individuals in a study where you are having physical contact with them, meaning that they are in physical proximity to you, is greater than minimal because they are engaging, their privacy is being reduced, etc. Also, the type of intervention that you might be doing, instead of doing like a naturalistic observation where you're just watching people at the KC and taking notes on their behavior, maybe you are giving them information about how to perform better on the SAT if you're in high, or the ACT. I guess it's SAT now. On the SAT or the GRE, whatever it is, the LSATs, whatever it is, you wanna give them some kind of intervention on how to perform better. That becomes greater than minimal risk because you're giving information. Generally, it's pretty low risk anyways, but it becomes greater than minimal risk automatically. Let's take a look at the distinction between the two. So minimal risk is the risk of harm is no greater than the risk encountered in daily life or routine tests. So if somebody is going to do a walking test to see if they can't walk and balance a yardstick, to take a look at some kind of hemispheric specialization in cognitive psychology, where you're looking at proprioception, feedback, and things like that. All sorts of fancy words, but it's kind of fun to research this kind of stuff. Probably not going to have anything more than minimal risk because it's just watching somebody doing something that is not going to increase their everyday risk. Now, somebody could trip and fall, right? But people can trip and fall going up the stairs too. It's not that big of a deal. Usually it's naturalistic observation. or working with collected and de-identified information, or in very simple cases where you have human contact or in physical proximity. But generally, that physical proximity will get bumped to at least expedited review if it's not exempt. Expedited review is not exempt, but it doesn't require the full review. There shouldn't have been an underline there. That's silly. It's not exempt, does not require full review because the participant interaction is limited. The limited review is when there is some review by the IRB because mild interventions are used, and it's usually with adults. So within minimal risk, there are 3 subcategories: the exempt, expedited, and limited. And it's really not just a checklist to fill out to see which level of review you're going to have to go through here. It's really about the subjectivity of the person reviewing the initial application, determining if there is a need for review. Now, greater than minimal risk requires full IRB review, meaning that there is some kind of research that is going to take the committee to review to make sure that it's done well so that you aren't accidentally doing something unethical. It's going to look and make sure that you've accounted for autonomy, that you've accounted for beneficence and justice in the research, that you have looked at protecting the identity and creating a good informed consent, and that the individuals are not going to be engaging in any undue stress because of it. They're going to have to look and to see, the IRB will, to see that you have done a good job of assessing the risk and determining if there is a need for additional review. Olivet College has an IRB application that I've linked to in the resource if you want to look at that. It includes sections that will require more review than others. So it's interesting to look at that. The yellow highlighted sections are the sections that are most important for student research. Generally, the IRB will cover research that's all the way from students who want to do like a research project. For the sake of learning and doing this class, you don't really need to go through the IRB process because it's fairly low stakes anyways, and it's survey research and it's for the sake of learning. But if you were intending on publishing, like doing a poster presentation for an honors project, you would need to use the Olivet College IRB application. And it goes all the way up to if faculty wanted to do research with the students at Olivet College. It would go all the way up to that, and that might be published in a journal or something. So Olivet College has one, and it's important for you to be able to use that document if you wanted to do other kinds of research. This is a flow sheet that I took from the text in the book. Maybe I'll move this and make it a little bit bigger so it's a little bit more readable. There, we'll do that. This is from your textbook, so it's in there. You can read it. But this is a flow sheet that talks about whether or not something needs review and what level of review it might need. And it goes, basically you start with, is the project research? Well, yes, if it's research, then it is minimal risk if it has those categories of minimal risk. If it doesn't have these, or if it has more than these, then you go into greater than minimal risk. Maybe you're working with a vulnerable population, maybe there's sensitive data, maybe there's deception. If it is, then it goes into greater than minimal risk. Interestingly, deception is a category that will automatically put you in a greater than minimal risk, because on an everyday basis, people don't expect to be deceived intentionally. I mean, we are deceived intentionally, but people don't expect that. So it's something that's more than what you would expect in everyday life. Everything else is minimal risk, and there are 3 different varieties of minimal risk based on an assessment of these key concepts covered here. I intended on looking at non-human animal research, but I'm going to skip that for the sake of time, and we're going to go right down to misrepresentation of ideas. If you want my soapbox on research of non-human animals, just ask me. But the standards for using non-human animals is much lower than with using humans. I like animals a whole awful lot. I won't use animals in research unless it's purely observational and the conditions that the observation occurs in is relatively naturalistic. Zoos is probably about the least naturalistic that I would go with. So, misrepresentation of ideas. This has to do with producing research. You're familiar with this, and yes, this is an ethical concern. So, fabrication, making up data is fraud. Okay, flat out, just fraud. Errors are different. When you make a mistake accidentally, it's an error. And generally, those are forgivable. You need to make sure that you make a correction. Errors do happen. Fraud shouldn't happen because it's an intentional fabrication of data. But error does happen. It's a mistake. We're allowed to make mistakes. Now, plagiarism is a little bit different. Plagiarism is fraudulent, but it has to do with the way that you are representing the ideas. So when you think of plagiarism, you have to think of, well, I didn't copy that word for word, or I made it my own wording. Okay, that's fine. But what you are considering is that you're only thinking of the words themselves. Plagiarism is an idea. Plagiarism is the idea that you are using somebody else's thoughts as your own. And that means that you put a thought down that you didn't use a reference for or a citation with. Using citations is the way that you overcome plagiarism. You can do word-for-word plagiarism, which is that copy and pasting, or you can do paraphrasing plagiarism, where you don't copy the idea word for word, but you're using the same ideas. If you aren't using your citations, then you are plagiarizing. And it doesn't matter if you meant to or not. It's, you can make an error by forgetting to include a citation, but if you aren't using citations, you are plagiarizing. Intentional or not, it is still plagiarism. It's using somebody else's ideas as your own. This flow sheet's pretty nifty. Most of the time it ends up with you need a citation. 2 out of 3 times you need a citation for a representation of your idea. Did I write the words? No. Then you quote the words and provide a citation. So if you didn't write the words yourself, if you're copying somebody else's words, which is appropriate from time to time, very sparingly. I wrote a 150-page dissertation and I used 1 quotation in the entire thing. Everything else is paraphrased because that's the reasonable thing to do. So did I write the words? No. Then you use a direct quote. Did I write the words? Yes, I paraphrased. Did I think of the idea? Well, no, I didn't think of the idea. Then you provide a citation for the paraphrase. Did you think of the idea? Yes, then there's no need for a citation. And generally in research, when you don't think of the idea, it tends to be a connective thing where you have 2 pieces of data that you recognize have a link between them. So if you said something like, well, Mr. Smith found, or Smith and all, let me start over. Smith, 2007, found that when you eat cereal, you're less likely to read the box if the box is not colorful. And then you find that Jones in 2008 said that if you have a colorful box and you read it, it's because it has lots of fun pictures. You could say something like, well, it seems that if you had colorful words, then you would be more likely to have people reading the cereal boxes. If you've connected those 2 ideas together, that's not plagiarism. You've thought of the idea. You've seen one idea, you saw another, you made a connection between them, and then you have created a new idea based on that. That does not require any kind of citation. We've covered an awful lot in this chapter. Ethics are important, or ethics is important. Ethics as a concept is important. So it's important that you're taking a look at this and taking it seriously. There are some ethical issues that go into the data analysis that you're going to be, the article response that you're going to be doing for this chapter. I encourage you again to look at the resources that are attached to the chapter, to read through the chapter carefully to make sure that you didn't misunderstand something. And most important, to apply these aspects to your research, especially the writing part. If you're missing a citation, you're plagiarizing. If you aren't getting informed consent, you aren't doing your study. There's lots of different ways to consider ethics as an important aspect of your research, but none of them are any less important than the other. So make sure that you are taking care of using the ethical principles in the APA as well as the Belmont Report to conduct your study. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I look forward to seeing what you can do in your article responses.